Hello, welcome back. We left off with the introduction of the Yamnaya, and that's where we'll pick up in this one. So I had been showing you this map, and the Yamnaya right there in the middle. So this map again, refresh your memory, is showing the clinal nature of genetic variation prior to 7,000 years ago. So this is what things look like with agriculture having spread across Eurasia. You have these two different clines, a northern cline and a southern cline. And then you have Europe, peninsular Europe over on the western part of the map that shows a mix of that southern cline of agriculturalist intermixed a bit with the hunter-gatherers who had been in Europe before then. Now, what happened on the steppes, the Central Asian steppes, in the northern part of this map was horses, horse domestication. You learned about the Scythians and their very tight cultural connection with horses and reliance on them for the way that they made a living on the landscape. So the Scythians came up with domesticating horses. They seem to have been the first ones who did it. We know that the Mycop were the first to come up, were the first to come up with the idea of wagons and being able to pull things around using your horses because they're so much stronger than we are. But the Yamnaya took both of these technologies and really pushed them to the next level. The Yamnaya is a cultural group that moved both westward and eastward from a focal area located just north of the Black Sea. They date to about 4,500 years ago, and they genetically are a mix of ancient North Eurasians and Eastern hunter-gatherers. They had no permanent settlements, as I had mentioned before with these pastoralist people, that they move around in order to provide food and water for their animals, and so they're always moving on the landscape to take care of the animals. So no permanent settlements. They mostly left behind burial mounds, kurgans, where people were buried with wagons and horses, and lots of artifacts. And so we have a sense of the jewelry that they would wear, the tools that they would use. The Yamnaya were the part of the Bronze Age, and so here you can see some of the bronze artifacts that they had as part of their culture. The Yamnaya are also associated with what's called the corded ware culture. The corded ware culture is named aptly after the way that they would decorate their pottery. You can see a pot here, and note that they had ropes, cords that they had then pressed into the pottery before it was fired and set, and so they decorated their pottery with this really cool pattern of cord impressions in it. Now, the Yamnaya in the corded ware culture, they domesticated sheep and cattle as well as horses, and with the aid of the wheel and the wagon that they had adopted from other cultural groups, they were able to move out of the steppe, and they did incredibly well in a much, much broader swath of the world, across Eurasia. Now I want to show you a map that gives you a sense of just how broad their expansiveness was. They took their culture and their genes, their alleles, their genetic variation, and moved out from that region just north of the Black Sea, as you can see in the center of this map here. Now this is showing, again, these pie charts that you're used to looking at, but instead of it being the pie charts that were showing genetic variation prior to 7,000 years ago, these are pie charts showing genetic variation of these populations, again, using ancient genomes, after the Yamnaya culture moved in. So you have the Yamnaya in the center region there. This population is now dated to about 3,300, so they had a long duration of time. So we start picking them up in the archaeological record at about 4,500 years ago, and then the genetic data we're picking up here at about 3,300 years ago. And notice that, you know, as you move further west, you have less and less of that Yamnaya ancestry in it, but clear evidence of the Yamnaya having contributed quite a bit of genetic variation to those populations in that region into Europe as you move west. And then as you move east, you can see that same thing. Yamnaya ancestry in those populations, in those pie charts as you move west, and especially as you move into the northern part of that geographic range. But they expand also the genetic variation is also represented in those southern pathway as well. So the authors of this paper, this is coming from that 2019 paper I mentioned in a video earlier, that I'm pulling a lot of this genetic data out of that paper. So in that paper, they also were interested in modeling the spread of the Yamnaya culture using the spread of the genetic variation. And here is their hypothesis for their proposal for how this spreading occurred. So you have the Yamnaya, the steppes, so the Yamnaya represented in the center of the map. The steppe ecology environment is shown in that green hashtag pattern. And you can see that broad swath across Eurasia there, but that the Yamnaya genetic variation and influence expanded far beyond their environmental region in which they originally arose. And so you can see that increasing, spreading to the east and spreading to the west, very much like the pie charts we were just looking at. But what they've done here as well is included a consideration of the range of Indo-European languages as we see them today. And the authors of that paper make the argument that the pervasiveness of Indo-European languages today corresponds to the pervasiveness of the Yamnaya genetic ancestry that we see in these populations today as well. So they make the argument that the genes and the language spread simultaneously with the spread of this cultural group. Let's look at this a little bit more. So this is the map at the top that you've looked at a couple of times now, that's showing the genetic variation prior to 7,000 years ago. And then below that is the proposed expansion of the Yamnaya culture much more recently. And you can see how you have this Yamnaya overprint happening on top of the genetic variation that was there before. So thinking about Europe, you then have these three different populations that have made a significant genetic impact on the people in Europe. So you had first the hunter-gatherers with the Aurignacians, the Gravettians, remember all of those people, the Magdalenians, and then you have the movement of agricultural groups from the southern part moving in, and then you have this Yamnaya expansion happening as well. So these three major groups of people moving into the European peninsula. I want to think a little bit about that ancestry of the people in Europe and how that is perceived by modern day people. I want to specifically look at the corded ware culture. And are there any political implications for research into these ancient people and the spread of their cultures? And yes, there is. Let me show you an example. I'm going to make this point by introducing you to a guy named Gustav Kosina. He's a German archaeologist, so born in 1858, and he lived until 1931. He identified the corded ware culture and looked at how it was spread across Europe. And let me give you a map of that spread. And he argued that they were originally, that the corded ware culture originated from what is now Germany and spread from there. So he was geographically a little bit off, because actually the corded ware culture, being the Yamnaya we know, was further to the east, closer to the Black Sea. But he did recognize what we also recognize today, which is the spread of these cultural artifacts from a center and going across Europe. Well, he argued that because the corded ware culture included the territories of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Western Russia of his time, that it gave Germans the moral birthright to claim those regions as their own. So the Germans, in the rise of the Nazis and the rise of nationalism in Germany, they were using archaeology to argue that where this archaeological group was distributed in the past meant that they had the right to those lands today. So Kosina's ideas they were embraced by the Nazis. So, was the migration propelled by innate biological superiority, which is what the Nazis were arguing, that the spread of that corded-ware culture was because of their biological superiority? Now, think about that now with Reich's ancient DNA research. So David Reich, this is the ancient DNA research we were just looking at. I had mentioned that those studies primarily have been coming out of David Reich's lab at Harvard. So think about this spread that they propose with this map here. And just frame shift a little bit the geographic region of where the Yamnaya Center is over to Germany, and it looks amazingly similar. And in fact, many of the archaeologists who were working with Reich and who are working today reacted with a lot of concern about these genetic results, and particularly a lot of concern with the way that the genetic results were written up and presented. And so there's controversy here. There's this sense of perhaps a tension between genetic data, genetics research, and archaeology. And is that tension inevitable? Is that just part of this process? I want to lay this little seed right here, plant this seed into your minds right now, because at the end of this module, I'm going to ask you to really explore that tension in a bit more detail with some readings and some other examples. So, planted the seed, and now we're going to get back to thinking about population expansions. So see you in the next video.